Hello and welcome to the anti-racism section of the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival today on a beautiful, beautiful July day. And thank you for joining us. Today we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. I've got Henny from Black Lives Matters in Dorset. I've got Patrick Roach, the chair of the Anti-Racism Taskforce, and Shavanagh, General Secretary of TUC Wales. And we're going to start with each speaker giving us a run through of, well, racism and the trade union movement and racism in Britain today. And there's a lot to say this week. There's always a lot to say, but this week has particularly put the focus back on racism for everybody. And I'm really delighted that our speakers have got a range of experience and a range of knowledge to bring to the conversation. Patrick will be talking about racism broadly, but also about the TUC's anti-racism task force. Henny will be talking about the local perspective, because obviously the regional variances around the experiences that people have, you know, are huge, and it would be really interesting to get that perspective. And also perhaps to talk a little bit about the Drax Estate march and protest that happened earlier, for those of us that weren't able to join it and hope to join it next year. And Shav, it'd be really interesting to hear from you about your experiences about TUC Wales, but also about what we need to do next, where we need to go before we open it for a broader discussion. So first I'm going to, it's my great pleasure actually to introduce Dr. Patrick Roach, NASUWT General Secretary, but also Chair of the Trade Union Movement Anti-Racism Task Force.
Thanks very much, Kudsia, and well, good afternoon, everyone. It is fantastic to be here once again, albeit virtually, for the Tolpuddle Festival. And, you know, as we just heard from Kudsia, what an important time for us to be gathering to talk about the fight against racism. Perhaps there is no more prescient moment than now for us to be doing so. You know, when I was thinking about what I might be saying today, my thoughts kind of went back to, you know, that period of my own formation, cutting my teeth as a trade unionist, as a community campaigner. And, you know, in the 1980s and the 1990s, it was unions that were fighting and leading the fight for racial justice. It was unions that were standing up against racism, joining with communities to challenge racism, standing with Neville and Doreen Lawrence in the fight for justice for Stephen Lawrence. It was trade unions and community organising that made the difference, and frankly, colleagues, that's making the difference now, and it needs to make that difference, because today those same injustices are still with us. Injustices that are affecting our everyday lives, our access to a decent job, our right to work, or the right to go to work without the fear of being racially abused, harassed, discriminated against, or victimised. But as you know, the last week has demonstrated the extent to which there is work to do to secure racial justice at work. And despite the Prime Minister's claims of levelling up, who here today can say that we have a government in Westminster, at least, that's on the side of working people? A government that's failed to deliver on a promised employment rights bill to strengthen employment and protections for all workers. A government that's failing to take action to stop the practice of fire and rehire. A government that's failed to distance itself from an appalling report of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities just a few months ago, which said that there is no such thing as systemic and institutional racism. Well, the past week has been provided an ample and timely reminder that there is such a thing as institutional and systemic racism in our society, which is impacting on the lives of working people. And it shows what happens when you create a hostile environment that this is what you get. This is what you get when you take a stand against prejudice and racism, when you refuse and when governments refuse to condemn the actions of those who, who boo you, who sneer at you, when you proudly take the knee. This is what you get when you show leadership. They belittle and they criticize us when we call for justice, when we call for respect and for dignity. They marginalize us, they exclude us, they harass us, and they belittle our principles, describing us as engaging in gesture politics, branding our racial justice champions as the enemies of promise. That's what you get. That's what you get when they deregulate and fail to show leadership, the leadership necessary so that all employers and corporations do the right thing, not their own thing, whatever they can and wherever they can seek to get away with exploiting ordinary workers. That's what you get when governments commission reports that try to tell us that racism is a figment of our imagination and when they deny our experience. But this is what you get, what we're doing here today, standing together today. Those of us who are fortunate to be at the festival in person, but the rest of us, of our movement, standing together, standing by as a movement, committed to taking action against racism, committed to saying that we will never be bystanders, that we will never stand by whilst racist thugs spread their message of hate and seek to provoke fear and prejudice, and when they seek to sow division in our workplaces, our communities, or in our country, that we'll never stand by while any worker, black or white, cleaner, shop worker, paramedic, teacher, or footballer, is a victim of racism when they're just doing their job. That we'll never stand by when children go to school hungry or face the prospect of holiday hunger, particularly children from poorer backgrounds, particularly children from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. That we will never stand by whilst workers are exploited by 0 hours contracts, by low pay and injustice at work, and where employers feel they can get away with fire and rehire practices, spreading fear, anxiety, and driving down the pay and working conditions of workers. And we will never stand by when any worker faces discrimination, bullying, or injustice at work or in their communities, because we know that racism is real and it's at work. It's in our workplaces, it's in our communities, it's on our streets, across our economy, in our education and criminal justice system, and in our social media. And we have to be proud. We have to make ourselves proud that as a trade union movement, we will be at the forefront of efforts to stand up against racism once again. Proud of our campaigning within our workplaces, within our communities, to challenge poverty, economic and social inequality, and to challenge racism, sexism, homophobia, disableism, and of course, institutional racism within our workplaces and in our economy. Because it's going to be our actions, the actions of trade unionists, that will be making the difference and once again bringing hope. Hope of decent rights, hope of a safer future, hope that actually we can have once again equalities legislation that will be properly implemented and enforced. Hope that actually we can narrow the gap, narrow that race pay gap which is widening in our workplaces. Hope for better and decent work, outlawing the cruel practice of 0 hours contracts and precarious employment. And through the work of the Anti-Racism Taskforce, we are committing that as a movement, that wherever racism and inequality and injustice exists, that our movement together is going to be acting, is going to be calling it out, because our movement won't be standing by whilst racism continues to operate and where white and black working people are pitched against each other, and whilst racial justice continues to exist. So I am proud, colleagues. I am proud of our movement. I'm proud to be chairing the Anti-Racism Task Force of the TUC, but I'm particularly proud to know that our movement is taking that leadership, is giving that support, and is actually saying that racism matters and that we will confront it hand in hand with our black workers, with our white workers, right across our entire movement. And it's important, colleagues, that we do just that. Most of all, though, colleagues, I'm proud that we are building a big agenda, that we're building an agenda not only to change the way in which our economy and our labour market functions, but actually challenging government as well. We're building an agenda which is actually saying that our movement needs to change, that we need to step up as well, and that we're saying that our movement has to be an inclusive movement, where all workers say that actually the best place to be is in a union, and where we say that if you're not in a union, then join one. And that as a movement, that we will be leading by example, changing the way in which our unions work, changing how we operate, improving our work on collective bargaining, on organising, but also putting the government's feet to the fire in demanding justice at work and in our communities too, including with the forthcoming independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. But you know, most of all, our anti-racism task force is about demonstrating that we stand together as black workers, as white workers, united in our workplaces and in our communities, united in challenging racism and defending rights at work. So let's be proud of what our movement has achieved, but let's be proud not only of our history, but of our commitment to do even more. Proud that we are ready to take on the challenges ahead, whatever they are, however they appear. So colleagues, with that, I want to say solidarity. Thank you for listening. Look forward to the debate. Thank you, Kudsia.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And I know that the feedback we're getting online has been, you've hit the nail on the head and really gauged the mood of where the movement is and where it needs to be. And I think also not pulled any punches about what challenges we face as a movement, but what challenges we face as a country. And I think it would be a really good time to bring Henny in to talk about Stand Up to Racism and the work that they're doing that really is, you know, out there doing that campaigning and really getting people informed and angry and hopeful. So Henny, I'm going to bring you in now.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I am a co-secretary of Stand Up to Racism Dorset, and I believe that what a lot of people fail to recognise is the direct correlation within Britain's involvement in the slave trade. In fact, I heard earlier today, we shouldn't be using terms such as slave trade. It should actually be, because it wasn't something in which it wasn't a trade, you know, it was a slave traffic, and the way our country is governed. And until this is addressed and acknowledged and made somewhat right through means such as reparations, there will always be a stunted rate in the aim for racial equality. I referred again earlier to an essay titled "Sources of Slavery: The Silence and Disclosures of Slavery Heritage in the United Kingdom and the US," written by someone called A.V. Seaton. And we're able to identify Britain's direct involvement within the slave trade, the slave traffic, sorry, and as a result, the remnants of what systemic racism has manifested to now within the 21st century. It was a royal grant from Charles II that was responsible for the shipping of 90,000 slaves in 1682, which by 1712, the South Sea Company was founded for this very reason, with shareholders including Queen Anne, her successor George I, and by 1720, the social roll call of membership included 462 members of the House of Commons and 100 members of the House of Lords. And in the way that this has transpired, in order to tackle racism in the workforce, you know, we must fully, I believe, pull apart these institutions and work again from the beginning, because we can't simply introduce, you know, means of making things right to an already flawed system where the scales are already weighted against people of colour. I believe as well that's so particular to the United Kingdom is that we are so effective at racial gaslighting. You know, its culture is this disingenuous veneer of civility where, you know, what one may deem as politeness is in fact a sanitizing of real emotion. When someone is to highlight that something is racist, you know, you're often met with a, oh, you sure that's not an overreacting? Or are you sure you misunderstood that? Or are you sure, you know, did you maybe realize if that's, you know, if you saw that in the right way? Because you wouldn't want to accuse someone of being racist. Whereas what we've seen a lot again is the accusation of being called racist is so much more outrageous than the racist incident itself, which again completely derails the whole conversation and brings it back to the center of the oppressor. It's a very violent means to dispel and diminish racist experience that Black people and people of colour face every single day. It's easy to call out overt racism. It's easy to point out and say that's wrong. Yet it's the covert means that I believe that people are not willing to have a discussion about. And until we are able to do that as well, I believe we won't be able to get anywhere. I once, in fact, worked for a local council where I was subject to really grotesque comments, and I overheard awful, awful conversations. Yet, due to the disregard of how, you know, Black people are, you know, when there's something is coming up, you know, we're often met with about how we're overreacting, and the racial gaslighting that does occur. It was in my best interest not to report it, because it's something that is so personal to me. If I'm going to bring this to the attention to the top, which again is often led by, at the top there is never any diversity, which when trickled down explains as to why, you know, there is such a culture of this happening. When I experienced this myself, I knew that it would be more personal and it would affect me a lot more personally than it would to them. To them, it would be a bit of an inconvenience. To them, I would be deterred almost to make this complaint. And I think as well, growing up in Dorset, you know, only in fact 2% of the Black population lives outside of urban areas. I grew up in between Poole and Dorchester all my life. And despite living here nearly all my life, I have never felt fully comfortable. And it was only until I went to places like London, or pre-pandemic, I moved to Paris to do my undergraduate. It was only when I stepped into those spaces where I was to feel more accepted and at peace than at the rural places within the UK. Dorset, the county in which I grew up, have the worst figures for stop and search. The police are 25 times more likely to stop and search a Black person than a white person. And it is the highest statistic in the whole of the United Kingdom. In fact, Dorset Police in November 2020 had to apologise for a racial profiling advert where they placed a Black boy on an advert for to try and raise awareness for drug dealing or something, and they since had to again apologise. These are the same institutions that are supposed to keep us safe. Yet, as we can continuously see through the systemic racism that has transpired through our history, this absolutely isn't the case. And I believe until we tackle this head on, and we're not polite about this, because this isn't a polite matter. Racism isn't polite. You know, it's hurtful, and it's very, yeah, it's hurtful, and it shouldn't be up to, you know, people of colour, Black people, to be having these uncomfortable conversations. If it's uncomfortable for you, imagine how uncomfortable it is for us. Yeah, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and I am optimistic. But yeah, I believe we shall tackle this head on from institutions. and challenge whatever comment you hear. You know, at the moment, you know, it's not racists don't feel uncomfortable to be spewing the hate that they do, and that needs to change. We need to make them feel uncomfortable. This is not a place where we can hear any of that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Henny, and thank you for sharing that. You know, and I think people forget that at the end of racism, there are people, and there are people and their experiences, and they are lived experiences. You know, it's not hypothetical, it's not happening to people over there. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think your note of optimism at the end is really, really important, because that's why all of us are involved. It's not just to highlight what's going on, but it's to tackle that and try to make it a difference. I'm going to be coming back to you in a minute, so hold on. Shav, can I please bring in Shavanagh Taj, Wales TUC General Secretary, to talk about, well, to add to the discourse today. Shav?
Thanks, Kudsia. I'm Shavanagh Taj, I'm the General Secretary of the Wales TUC. I'm a trade unionist, I'm a socialist, and I refuse to remain silent while nothing is being done to deal with anti-Black racism. And I have a right to be angry, as do you. Firstly, I wanted to send my solidarity to the many activists and union reps, both those in the public eye and those that we don't actually see on our TV screens, organising in our workplaces, often in an extremely hostile environment, under a UK government who keeps telling us that taking the knee is seen simply as gesture politicking. We've got to celebrate and take note of the many who have countered such claims and have continued to, you know, carry on in the workplace, looking after our loved ones, making sure that, you know, our hospitals have continued to run, our care homes, you know, making sure that our supermarket shelves are being stacked, and ensuring that our post and goods are being delivered and our refuse is being collected as well. You continue to inspire each and every one of us to do better, to keep standing up and keep uniting against injustice and racism. And I want to thank today's organisers and many of the, and our previous speakers as well, who have already had so much to say on something that we could just continue talking about forever and a day. And I think that, you know, as the previous speaker mentioned, the British slave trade may have ended in 1807 and slavery in 1833. However, racism itself wouldn't end with abolition, as it was deemed far, far too valuable. And lots of academics and activists have said that racism became the handmaiden to the empire. So the mythology of race and white superiority would become a major ingredient in the establishment of British imperialism. And this kind of historical template of bigotry and prejudice still permeates in society. And, you know, as previous speakers have already given a really good insight into what the new racist state-sponsored hostile environment looks like and operates like on a daily basis, Black bodies are still considered easily disposable and free to use for cheap labor, which is why we must be front and center in leading and demanding that change. Nothing about us without us. Self-organization, community action is what ultimately brings us together. And that is why it is very important that we continue to support many of the Black-led movements and activism that we are seeing taking place. A year on since the brutal murder of George Floyd, we've continued to build our collective strength against fascist, racist far right, but we can't see this as some kind of existential threat that happens solely on the streets in America or on social media, where, you know, we have footballers and famous people being harassed and trolled. No, many of these racist misogynists actually live and work amongst us. Many of them are in extremely powerful positions in politics, within public services, police and court system. So we actually have a massive job on our hands to organize in our workplaces for Black liberation and Black progress. And we must build structures and systems that are strong and collectively supported by trade unions to call it out and to push for that change, to dismantle and to rebuild. And to do this, we are going to have to of course, build that pressure to remove these people from their positions of power who are actively standing in the way of progress to equality, justice, and freedom, including any racist, fascist bigots who think they can run union branches, engage with employers, and fail to tackle institutional racism and systemic inequality and stand in the way of progress, which is why, of course, the TUC has once again set up the Race Taskforce, which they did during the launch of the Stephen Lawrence campaign so many years back. But not only is the task force, of course, going to be looking to tackle what the government is doing in terms of disproportionately impacting Black workers, but we are also having a real moment of self-reflection as a trade union movement. We are looking to see what more can be done to ensure that Black leadership is thriving and is a reality within our movement. Comrades, nothing ever changed or was worth winning without a firm fight. I was raised by strong women and men who nurtured and encouraged me to believe in the importance of using my voice for the greater good, so that others, most often the held back or the left behind, could see and hear what it means to step into your power and to actually own it. So it's important that we understand that any anti-racism work we do has got to be sustainable. We can't simply put the work in now, move a few goalposts and then sit back and pat ourselves on the back. We have got to be very aware of the forces at play, the power dynamics, the interplay that we're seeing at work on a day-to-day basis, this cronyism, the pitting one side against the other whilst continuing to damage the lives of poor working people can and does actually happen. So our work has got to continue going beyond the 9 to 5. This isn't simply about ticking boxes or window dressing. But, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful the change is coming. Our movement has got to continue working with organizations like Stand Up for Racism, Black-led third sector organizations, and the visible, impressive campaigners and activists within our Black Lives Movement as well. But we can't give up on hope for humanity or equity and social justice, where Black and white people can unite to kick racism out of our workplaces and our communities. We've got to continue supporting our family campaigns against racism, police and criminal justice failures, and deaths in custodies as well. Here in Wales, we've continued to put our movement's full strength in numbers behind the campaign for justice for Christopher Capessa, Free Sianda, Justice for Mahmoud Hassan, and Moeed Bashir, because we definitely are very clear the Wales is not innocent. The Wales TUC continues to work as well with the First Minister's Race Advisory Group as we develop the Race Equality Action Plan and start working through our pan-equality structures as well to ensure that we are then, as a movement, also delivering on those recommendations. We've support Black-led initiatives like a phone helpline that was set up to support Black activists and union members, both those people who are members of a union and who are not yet members of a union as well. And of course, we've got to ensure that Black and brown people, activists, union members, are not left alone when they stick their heads above the parapet, because they often become targeted and then negatively impacted for daring to speak out in the workplaces. Unions will and must back you up. We've got to be there, both in terms of our campaigning, but also in terms of our legal representation and our support. And of course, support for self-care as well. The previous speaker was talking about mental health and well-being and how that has got to be prioritized, because racial gaslighting is a very real lived experience, and it can genuinely shake you to the core and potentially break you. So it's our duty on each and every one of us to say no to racism. We do have to move to a position of zero tolerance to racism, and we've got to continue to build our strength, but also to act as one strong, united, collective voice for the masses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shav, and thank you for highlighting how much there is still to be done and how much we still need to do as a movement, but also in partnership with other organisations. I'm going to bring all three panelists back in, and perhaps we could have a discussion. We've had a stream of questions come through from Facebook and from YouTube, and I think it would be really good to get your opinions on those. But what I want to start with actually is to talk about this week particularly. This week, it seems, has put race back on the agenda for people whom race might have been off the agenda. And I say that, and I use those words carefully, because for some of us, it's never off the agenda. It's lived, it's entrenched, it's challenges and battles every day. But this week, it seems everybody has been talking about racism. And I was just thinking, Henny, what you were saying about living and growing up in Dorset, and actually not really feeling like you belonged until you went to London and then to Paris. And I reflected on that a lot. Never really feeling like I was English. You're not really allowed to be English if you are not white English. You know, that was very much the discourse growing up. But this week has really brought what it means to be English, what England means, what it means to be part of the United Kingdom, I think, to the forefront. So I'd like to open that up to you about what impact you think this week has had. What are your thoughts and reflections? And also, how do we galvanize this week as a watershed moment and use it to shape the conversation going forward? Just a small question there for you.
No, thank you very much. I mean, yeah, this week it's been really hard. And I think a lot of you know, people of colour, well, Black people really share that sentiment. I think it's almost as if, you know, as soon as those penalties were missed, you knew what was going to come. You knew exactly, and it did, and it came with full force, and it was rampant, and it was violent, and it shows. It's just, you know, the 180 that happens just a few days before. You know, they're hailing them as heroes, which they absolutely are. But it's almost as if our right to be here is an exchange. It's like it's purely based upon our excellence and what we're able to contribute to here, when that shouldn't be the case. You know, it's almost as if we have to prove ourselves every single time. And as soon as, you know, people aren't given what they wanted, you know, it reverts right back to, you know, the really, really violent, racist abuse. I think that the government response as well is really interesting. I mean, just at the beginning of the Euros, they refused to condemn those who were booing that took the knee. They refused to condemn those who took the knee. But yet now, you know, Boris Johnson's telling people to go and crawl back under the rock that they came from. Like, what rock is he going to crawl back under? Like, I think as well, I think it's something that, you know, we should absolutely take note and realise that it's not genuine, any of the government responses. Priti Patel's tweets are almost sickening. You know, the hate that she has now been condemning is the same hate that she has helped fuel, you know? I think moving past, I think that, you know, it's another sad reminder, not that, you know, Black people need a reminder, but just of how rife and evident it is. And, you know, this didn't go away last summer when people were marching for Black Lives Matter. This didn't go away. Maybe this is the first time a lot of people heard that, you know, this was an issue, or realized that it was an issue. And it still continues to be an issue, and an issue that, you know, needs continuous work on. So thank you.
No, thanks, Henny, and thanks for articulating that so beautifully, because I think you're right that, you know, Black people up and down the country, when it got to the penalty shootout, weren't excited because of how it was going to go, but ultimately were fearing what would happen if the outcome were negative, because, you know, it's lived experience. Hold us to doubly high standards, and then when those unrealistic expectations aren't met, which is the right of every human being to, you know, to do, then the repercussions are hard and they are fast. So I think you're absolutely right, and you know, thanks for outlining that, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so much can be said about you know, the events of Sunday night, Monday morning, and what's transpired since then. But none of us should be surprised by any of that. I mean, it's interesting actually, Kudsia, because when you were framing the question there for us, one of the things that you said was what it means to be British, what it means to be English. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, Scotland and Wales were also knocked out of the Euros. I don't recall this as a response from those nations. And the political leadership, and I'm not taking a partisan position here, but the Tories do have a lot to answer for. The political leadership that's been shown in Scotland and in Wales, not just around football, but actually, you know, across the piece. I mean, we've got Shav here today who can speak far more eloquently than I about, you know, the Welsh government's plans to make Wales an anti-racist country. I mean, that is not my language. That is the language of the Welsh government, to make Wales an anti-racist country. When we have ministers in Westminster who not only deny that we should be talking about race and racism, but who actively, you know, are fighting, call them culture wars, call them what you will, but effectively are attacking anybody who wants to speak out on the issue of racial injustice. So there is something about what's happening in England at this moment in time, which is also about what it means to be British. And maybe this is one of the tensions that we're going to be seeing in terms of fault lines about the future of the union. If Boris Johnson wants to keep the union intact, then, you know, he's going to have a lot of soul searching to do in terms of what's happened during the course of this week. But what it means to be a worker, and I mean, I also thought that Shav's remarks earlier in her intervention were absolutely spot on, because it's about what it means to be a worker. We've had workers from all ethnic, racial and religious backgrounds who've been there on the front line since March 2020, keeping our country going, giving us all hope. And we had a diverse group of workers. They happen to be called professional footballers, but they're workers nevertheless, who last week gave the nation hope. I think we've got to recognise that this raises big issues about the nature of work, about safety at work, about the rights of workers to be able to go to work safely without being abused, without being told, you know, well, you're a nurse from a black or minority ethnic background, I don't want you treating me, you're a care worker, you're a teacher, you name it. So we've got to ask those very serious questions about the nature of work and what we aspire for. But I think in terms of where next, I have a lot of hope. I mean, this week, the TUC affiliated unions have responded, not only by saying, you know, down with this sort of thing, we don't like racism. Of course not. Of course we don't. But doing what unions do, show solidarity. Stand together with, you know, our sisters and brothers who are suffering those attacks, being prepared to speak out about it, almost regardless of the consequences, and taking action to seek to defeat it. Continuing our campaigning effort, that's going to be important in terms of how we move forward. Working, I mean, for my union, the NASUWT, working with our sister unions to insist on an inclusive and anti-racist curriculum, because we need to hope for a better future. You know, the point was made earlier that, you know, we need to be unpicking and unpacking our institutions, pulling them apart, including the knowledge-based institution about, you know, what makes Britain today, what does it mean to be English today. And we have to, as unions, demand the change that we want to see and not be afraid to do that. And so I do have hope, not because of Sunday night, Monday morning, that was all to be expected, but actually because of the response that we've seen to what happened on Sunday night, Monday morning. that actually we can do something here, we can do something different, and actually we can shame Boris Johnson and his cabinet for the actions that they've taken.
Thanks, Patrick. And I think you highlight something really important there, which is the attack on working people that has taken place. And you know, and it was played out on a world stage over the weekend. But the reality is we have seen attacks on working people played out systemically and structurally during the course of the pandemic. You know, when we deconstruct who has borne the brunt of the pandemic, who has borne the brunt in terms of job losses, in terms of deaths, in terms of long COVID, in terms of impact, we know that people working on the front line have done it. And we know that the profile of those people is Black and minority ethnic people predominantly. Obviously, other groups are affected, but they are through failings of protection. And Shav, I wanted to bring you in here to talk about, because you mentioned those in your opening remark, and you mentioned the role of working people, and you mentioned, you know, how they kept this country running. And what are your thoughts on how they've been treated and how we support and how we rally to make sure that working people continue to be front and center of your government, of our government, and of conversations and discourse around supporting them through race, or challenging racism, should I say?
Thanks, Kudsia. Interesting question. So what I would say is that, you know, at times like this, you it's important to apply a bit of philosophy as well. And I'm a big Rumi fan. So, you know, like they talk about, Rumi talks about 3 gates. And he says, you should apply, first of all, think, is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? And sometimes I just think, particularly when it comes to like social media, where people kind of get on there quite sometimes with fake identities and what have you, and they think it's perfectly fine to just go after somebody. And then you get this pile-on, and it carries on and it carries on. And what was interesting during the pandemic, of course, was the TUC had done some research a couple of months before the pandemic hit in relation to Black workers, their experience in the workplace in terms of racism and discrimination, how that compared to their colleagues, to their white colleagues. And they repeated a similar sort of bit of research not long after the pandemic. And the crazy thing is that the research previously and the research afterwards was so similar in that people always felt that it was very difficult for them to speak out in the workplace, that it was very difficult for them to be believed. So the fact that you are not believed when you talk about your experience. And there's a real sense of like vulnerability, right? And also one of the things that people sometimes fail to understand is that when you were not believed, then all of a sudden you question yourself. And with that, sometimes workers have said comes a level of shame, because it's a case of, well, I'm being told that it's safe for me to come out and to speak. I'm being extremely vulnerable here. I'm talking about my Black lived experience, and these people are telling me now is not the time. So it wasn't the time before the pandemic, and it was always a case of we'll get there eventually. And then during the pandemic, it wasn't the time because you've got a job to do. And then we're going through this period of the supposed aftermath. But the reality is that those workers, there is no aftermath because COVID is still a reality. Sorry. So in terms of their experience, it's just kind of continued. And I feel like we have attempted to put some plasters on some of these issues, whereby we focus on the health and safety bit around making sure that there's risk assessments as part of that PPE, as part of that, you know, where you can have, a good testing machinery and regime and so forth. But that in itself hasn't addressed racism. That hasn't addressed the discrimination. All that's happened is that they've got better PPE, but they're still having to do the jobs that their white colleagues are not doing. So we've we haven't actually addressed the real issues. So at what stage do these factors become core factors in our negotiating and bargaining when we are talking to employers? So I think that there's something, you know, genuinely to be said about that. So we as a movement need to think about how we can deal with those issues, because the reality is that there's a lot of people having breakdowns. And at the moment, on the face of it, they're showing one face at work, but when they're away from work, it's a completely different experience, and the trauma that they're continuing to experience. Even during COVID, you know, what workers were being told, you know, what was being said to them in terms of the direct verbal abuse and sometimes physical abuse that they were facing has been incredible. That hasn't changed. PPE didn't change that. Testing didn't change that. Social distancing didn't change that. That is still carried on happening. So we've got to think about how do we tackle these things, but also how do we genuinely deal with long-standing issues, inequalities. How do we genuinely bring about equity and social justice? And as we, you know, at some stage begin those conversations about building back, that we genuinely do build back equally, but equitably, which actually means that for some of those workers who have continued to have that negative experience, you might genuinely have to do more. So this isn't just about creating a level playing field, or if we get equality, everything will be better, because there's a lot of catching up to do in order to get that equality in the first place. So we're not talking about the catch up. There's going to be so much work just to have the catch up for us to have that baseline. And then what happens from there onwards, well, that's a whole different conversation. But, you know, I think that this as well does go back to, if people are going to be, you know, encouraged to speak up in the workplace, unions need to be organized enough. I'm genuinely really concerned at the moment about the fact that there are so many external organizations, consultants being brought in to fix things in the workplace. They're being brought in, and people are being encouraged to talk to these, you know, caregivers. But there's no long-term strategy, and the real long-term strategy has got to be an industrial bargaining strategy, and that's where unions have then got to organize, and employers, you know, have got to understand this is a little temporary fix. And you know, in Wales things are different in that we have got a Labour government that does engage with unions on a social partnership basis. Does not mean things are perfect, but at least they're attempting to kind of move things along, which is why I always say to people, don't get complacent, because they allowed us a seat at the table and we can sit there and have a bit of cake. It don't mean that we've got everything. It, like, a lot has still really not changed, and that trickle down economical effects that we've been told about all of these like years, it's not real, is it? So there's a lot to be done, but I genuinely believe that, you know, unions are the only real independent force that can kind of dismantle and recreate.
On that note, Shav, I have a challenge and a question for you, right? And that challenge and question is, do you think unions are currently safe enough spaces for those Black voices? And if they are not, and I think I know the answer to that, because how many people do I see that look like me, that look like you, that look like Patrick in our movement? What needs to be done? And I say this partly knowing some of the answer, because I'm very, very proud to be, you know, adjacently associated with the Anti-Racism Taskforce and part of the work that's directed there. And I'll be asking Patrick the same question. But from your perspective, and particularly from not having a government that is so openly hostile, what needs to be done for us to build those spaces that Black working people are integral parts of?
I think that's an interesting question, because are unions currently safe spaces for Black workers to talk about their lived experience and to be challenging and pushing and demanding for change? I'm not sure every single part of our union of our movement is there yet. I think that there is so much work to be done, which is why I'm always really, there probably isn't a week that I don't get a message from someone, either someone I know, someone I don't know, who says, Shav, we need to set up a union for Black workers. Okay, we need a Black trade union. We need a Black trade union because the other mainstream unions are white unions. They actually openly refer to them as white unions. So they're like, we need a Black union. And so that in itself is very telling over, whether or not we've got it right. I think that the TUC, in terms of the task force that they've set up, is important. And that piece around the internal reflections is going to be hard. And I say it's going to be hard because it's similar to what I was saying about the catch-up bit in terms of government policies and structures and systems. In order for there to be, for us to even slightly tip the balance, we're going to have a very real conversation about giving up some power. Mm-hmm. And to give up some power is going to mean not just a couple of little chairs moving around the place or bringing a couple of extra chairs to the table, but it's going to genuinely mean you're going to have to step aside. You're going to have to step aside. Me, so-and-so, so we're now going to be in the driving seat. I'm not saying each and every one of you must disappear, but when does that time come? When are you going to trust me? Because up until now, it kind of feels like you've been tolerating me, just like the government talks about being a tolerant country. Sometimes it does feel like the union, we just, because we're trade unionists, we will never, ever believe that we can be racist, that we can have racist systems and structures, but truly, really and truly, we're just a reflection of society. People are people, we like to be, but I think the difference is that with trade unionists, we're willing to do the work and we're willing to be challenged, but equally, those challenges are going to be tough. And so there's gonna be some tears along the way. And the reality of white fragility is going to get played out. And that's not just a word, it's not just a term, it's very real. Because again, in the same way, I think was mentioned about when you talk about your experience, then all of a sudden the other person is like, well, you're calling me a racist, then that I must be a terrible human being, and all the focus becomes on that person, and it gets taken away. It just like the fact that you've been so brave to speak about this, and then all of a sudden this other person is looking that way. And sometimes when it comes from people you would never expect it from, because they've always fought the good fight. And when that happens, and I've experienced this many times, actually over the last couple of years, I'd say more so because of the fact that we're talking about race now. It's no longer a Black workers conference matter, but we're talking about it in mainstream spaces. And we as people of color are taking up spaces, but but equally, we don't want to just take up spaces where we only talk about race, because I'm a human being, I'm multifaceted. I could talk about so many other things. I want to talk about the economy. I want to talk about jobs. I want to talk about how do we create a better future. I want to talk about climate change, So don't just box me and think that's the only platform that I'm good enough for. I have a range of different identities. I can talk on so many other issues just like you can. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
no, I think you have. And I think, the identification that we're not exempt from the problems of society as a movement, but really we've got to face them head on and challenge them. And, and recognize that Black working people are three-dimensional, aren't just, let's shove another equality officer role in, is absolutely crucial. And they're the honest conversations that need to be had. Patrick, as someone who knows the movement inside, outside, upwards, downwards, backwards, what are your thoughts?
Well, our unions are never going to be safe spaces until all of our members are safe. The TUC did some fantastic work just at the start of the pandemic, actually, looking at the experiences of black workers in their workplaces and asking the question about COVID safety. Have you reported your COVID safety concerns to your boss? And not surprisingly, black workers were saying, no, we haven't reported it to our boss, because if we did that, we'd be ignored, it would be denied, we'd be challenged or criticised, we might lose our job. Have you reported it to your union? No, because we might not be believed. I mean, that is pretty damning indictment, I think, of our movement. That actually our unions, for many black workers, don't feel a safe enough space. And what Shav was just saying a few moments ago about, black workers who are saying they want something better, but they've had enough. They want something now which is different. Workers of my parents' generation came to this country and were loyal to trade unions. They paid their dues week in, week out, as it was at the time. Didn't ask a lot of their unions, and then when they did ask something of their unions, weren't always as supported as they should have been. So what's changed? Has enough changed? Clearly, we need to bring about that change. And I think that's what the Anti-Racism Task Force is very much about, to ensure that our unions have safe spaces, whether that's about branches, in fact, safe spaces from the shop floor, the workplace organisation, the bargaining unit within your workplace, through to your national executive, or indeed your general counsel of the TUC. It's got to be a safe space at all of those levels, and it's got to be a space where actually black workers, the black voice, doesn't feel precarious. You don't feel that actually not only are you going to be ignored or your views denied, but actually that you're going to be attacked for raising the issues in the first place. I think that the task force is about developing that sense in which how do we measure the progress that we're making as unions? What do we look like currently? Who do we represent? Who has voice? Who has the resources in our organisations? We've got to find a way of fixing ourselves if we're really going to be credible in seeking to fix others, particularly employers and government. And that means being safe for our members, but also it means being safe for the workforce in trade unions as well. That's crucially important. Shav and I have reached these, some would say, dizzy heights of being labelled general secretaries. I don't know what it means for Shav, but many of the experiences that I had cutting my teeth, whether formerly as a teacher or as a policymaker or as a trade unionist, those same experiences are lived today. You may occupy a position of seniority, but actually, whether you're believed, whether your views are denied, or whether you're attacked for actually speaking out on the issues, those are the realities for black workers, regardless of where they are within their organisations, and particularly within unions. So we do need, as a movement, to come together, and that's what the task force is about. And we need to ensure that union leaders, white as well as black, right across our movement, are prepared to take a stand and to say, I'm willing to ask this question. I'm willing to be made uncomfortable about where my union is and where I am in terms of the journey for racial justice. And I'm willing to open up that conversation with my members about that. That's one of the things that unions are doing. The NASUWT is doing exactly that. We're having the conversation, not me having the conversation, but our union is having that conversation with our members, white and black, about where we are and where we want to be. And that's going to be uncomfortable. And unions that have been on that road will know that it's uncomfortable. But you have to do it. You have to do it because otherwise, which direction are you facing in? Otherwise, who else is standing alongside you in that battle for making progress within your unions? And you know, who's going to own the decisions that eventually you'll be taking about the change that needs to occur? So we need honesty. We need to be upfront in a way that perhaps some politicians aren't. But as a movement, we can be honest, because Shav said it a few moments ago. We're no different to the communities that we're a part of. But one of the things that we are like, as well as our communities, is we recognise our limitations, and we know that actually that where change needs to occur, and have the will to do something to bring about that change. So, are we safe? Not safe enough. But we're on a journey to actually change who we are, what we are, and how we go about ensuring that we do truly represent the interests of every one of our members.
Thanks, Patrick. And I think it's really important to say that the Anti-Racism Task Force is driving that change, or is supporting unions driving that change. And, you know, and it's something that if people are interested in, there are regular updates on the TUC website. Do let us know, because there is always something to share. And it's not about pats on the back. It's about reflecting what challenges have we got in front of us, and how do we as a movement rally to face those challenges. I want to bring Henny back here. Henny, I really want to bring you back here, because you led the or you spoke at the protest at the Drax Estate, and I think that's a really good point in which to bring it all back together. You know, we're talking about the challenges that are currently faced. We're talking about what needs to be done to make spaces safer. Could you bring us back to the march, the protest, and, you know, and remind us partly why we're here today, and partly how we are still faced with those reminders of what's happened?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I attended and spoke at a rally today outside the Shavanagh estate, Richard Drax Estate. He is an MP for South Dorset. He is the richest parliamentarian, and his wealth has been accumulated through his ancestors' direct links to slavery. I spoke earlier about how ingrained you know, it is within UK society, the fact that a royal warrant was, you know, granted for the and was responsible for shipping 90,000 slaves. The South Sea Company that was founded, the director of that was a direct ancestor from Richard Drax. Another of his direct ancestors, James Drax, arrived to Barbados. And the Drax family has been responsible for structuring and designing a structure of slavery that has been implemented and copied throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. CARICOM, the Caribbean Reparation Committee, describes the Drax Estate in the Caribbean, in Barbados, as a killing field and a crime scene. This is a plantation in Barbados that is still owned by Richard Drax. So we are calling for, we're joining forces with our brothers and sisters in Barbados, and we are calling for the return of this estate. When asked about his previous links to ancestry and slavery, he replied in 2010, in the run-up to the general election, he replied with, "Oh, I ignore it." And it's a response that honestly isn't surprising, because it's something that parallels the UK education system. You know, the institutions within the UK echo that very sentiment. They ignore it, they cover it up, they act as if, oh, that was years ago, it was years ago, when in fact, no, like, Richard Drax is a direct ramification of his ancestry. And he currently sits behind the longest wall in England in that ridiculous estate, when so many go homeless, go hungry. And what we're asking for in the return is, you know, an active step in terms of reparation. Reparation is about parity, which is the active enabling of equality. And until steps like this are done, you know, there's a long, long way to go in making things right, which, you know, you can never make things right as such. But we must take pragmatic steps in order to do this. And the return of Drax Hall will be one, and he will return it. There's no need for him to be in ownership of a plantation that his ancestors owned years ago, that got him to the power that he is at now, that he is still profiting off. It needs to be returned to the people of Barbados. The power needs to be returned to them, to which they can utilize as a learning center, as a resource center, and as an education tool. Because education, I believe, is the most prominent at every single level where we can start. You know, there's a lot that needs to be done, yet education is, I believe, the very beginning. It's imperative at every single level, in the workplace, in schools, in colleges, at nurseries. So, yeah, if anyone is interested in that, you can visit the Stand Up to Racism Dorset Facebook page, where there's an open letter addressed to Mr. Drax, where we're asking him politely, which we have done many a times, to simply talk. All we want to do is have a conversation about the return of this estate. So yeah, for more information, please visit the Stand Up to Racism Dorset Facebook page.
Thanks, Henny. And, you know, it still baffles me that in the year 2021, we're talking about this, about these direct links that we can make, and the profiteering and the root of murder and the root of trafficking that's gone into them, and people be undisturbed and unperturbed by it. So thank you for highlighting it, and thank you for continuing to campaign on it. I would love to go back to Patrick to talk about education, but we have run out of time, and I am so sad. But what I will say is I'm always reminded by a quote that I heard following the riots in America after the death of George Floyd last year. And it's that, you know, Black people have suffered through so much, and to give equality is the very least when there are other issues like reparations and revenge, which are equally valid. But equality is what's most important. And I don't think we should ever, you know, really veer away from that. And I think, you know, with organizations like yours, Henny, and with the work that we do in our movement, it's really important that we work together and start to chip away at those that would deny that equality. Nigel, I'm going to bring you in now, because otherwise I'm just going to carry on talking forever. And just to say thank you, Henny, thank you, Shav, thank you, Patrick, for all giving up the most beautiful of weekends. And